session of today. We'll have Chris Knight from the Medical Anthropology Group speaking about Chomsky and Epstein. He'll be introducing for about an hour, and then we'll, of course, have the discussion. Chris, over to you. Okay.
1991, I published a work which I'd been struggling with for several decades on the origin of human society. For various odd reasons, I was persuaded to call it Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture, which of course made it seem, at least to some people, oh, it's a book about menstruation. It was a book about how we became human, socially, politically, in terms of kinship and ritual and everything else. And I'm really proud of that book. I think it's a good book, which should be more widely read. And I know around the world, different groups, particularly Marxists, they're astonished. I've just been having a lot of correspondence with comrades in Chile, just absolutely astonished that that book isn't much more widely read, and they want to do a translation to the Spanish. There's another bunch of people in Germany who wanted to, who actually already done a German translation. That book, as far as I was concerned, it was kind of it. I didn't want to write too many more books. I'd done it, and from the early 1990s onwards, my plan really was to move from theory to practice. I wanted to actually help organize the revolution. That was the most urgent thing to do, not to write another book. I didn't really think that what the planet most needed was another book, even though Blood Relations had a conspicuous hole in it, a huge absence. There was nothing about language. I mean, how do you write a book about the origin of what it means to be human and ritual, social organisation, all the different aspects of symbolism and stuff, and yet not deal with language in that book? Well, the reason was because I just felt I didn't understand language. I had to, if I wanted to write a book on the origin of language, I'd have to do some really, really, really difficult research, because every time I read the world's #1 theoretical linguist on the topic of what language is and where it came from, namely anything by Noam Chomsky, I just thought, what? I just don't understand this. It doesn't make any sense to me. I tried reading aspects of the theory of syntax, or syntactic structures of all these books. Why does it not make any sense to me? And initially I was relatively modest, I suppose. I just thought, well, I suppose if you try to read Einstein and you haven't really mastered the basics of mathematics, you're going to find you've got difficulties. I'm going to really have to set aside some time to read this stuff properly, really thoroughly. I really have got to read Chomsky. Now you have to realise that through the sort of late 70s, 80s, 90s, and afterwards, only one paradigm, only one theoretical framework was regarded as really solid, tried, tested, genuine science. And that was transformational grammar, which went through different incarnations, different versions. But if it wasn't Chomsky, it wasn't the real thing. I've got to master Chomsky. So I tried really hard, starting, I suppose, around 2005, 6, 8, in that sort of period. And I really did try. I remember reading a paragraph from aspects of the theory of syntax. I haven't got the quote here, but it was all about how the meaning of a sentence doesn't reside on the surface, not surface structure. It's within the deep structure, while at the same time the deep structure, as you investigate it further, turns out to be the surface structure. So I thought, okay, it's not the surface structure, but it's the deep structure, which, if you think about it, turns out to be the surface structure. Now, that didn't make a lot of sense, but I knew I had to just try harder. And it took a while, it took several years, actually, for the penny to drop, for me to realise that what looked like incomprehensible nonsense really was incomprehensible nonsense. It was kind of disappointment in a way, but it's evidently incomprehensible nonsense. Now, obviously, my own interest, connected up with what I've written about before, was not with sort of the nature of language, but with how it emerged, the evolutionary origins of language. And what I noticed was that although Chomsky's number one insistence, his number one point, was always that language is not culture, language is not social life. You can't approach language using any kind of social science, social theory, social perspective, or even communicative perspective, because language is biology. Language is biology. To study it, you have to use rigorously and only exclusively what he described as natural science. Natural science, but there's not a particle of anything social in it. Now, in order to restrict the study of language to nature and methods of natural science, it's a bit hard, isn't it? But it's language. I mean, surely language hasn't it got a function, namely social communication, communicating ideas? Well, Chomsky had to insist that linguistics is a natural science, a purely natural science, partly because he was bitterly hostile to Marxism. Not just Marxism, but Durkheimian materialism, as well as anything vaguely connected with Marxist approaches. So anything social had to be sort of eliminated from the study of language. A bit difficult, I thought. Surely one person talking to another is something to do with social interaction. No. In order to establish that natural science alone, something like physics and chemistry, is sufficient, he had to say something additional. Language is not properly regarded as a system of communication. I mean, let's make it a little bit simpler. Language is not for communicating. Language does not have, he actually says this, a social function. Then he says, of course, you can use language for communication. I mean, after all, you can use your hairstyle to communicate something, or the way you walk. I suppose you can slam a car door, or break a window or something and make a point. But language is not specifically designed for communication. It's not in itself social. I don't know what you think of that, but it's odd. So what is it for then? It's a cognitive system. It's for computation. It's for internal, private computation. When the whole point of speech is to think clearly. So when in the past perhaps just one single human, kind of, how does he put this all? You'd think that if you have argued that language is biological, you deduce from that it must have evolved. Mistake. No, language didn't evolve. What happened is that language is a genetic development. There was a gene, or perhaps, I sometimes think he must have surely thought that you need one or two genes, but no, he usually just says one genetic mutation was sufficient to create language in an instant. So his story, what actually happened was that I think I had quite an influence. In 1997, with a colleague called Jim Herford up in Edinburgh, Department of Linguistics, he and I started an international conference series called EvoLang. And one of the reasons I set up EvoLang was because I realized that the origin of language is a hugely complicated problem, and I just thought, well, we're not going to be able to crack this problem. That one of us is having a good idea, me, Jim, somebody else. We're going to have to get together all the relevant scientists, all the primatologists, all the geneticists, all the linguists, different kinds, bring them all together, have a big conference, and maybe with the most specialized, dedicated minds homing in on this problem, we might have some chance of cracking the problem of the origin of language. So we had this conference in 1996 up in Edinburgh. We had a previous conference in London, which was more general on other issues as well as linguistics. And we published a book. I edited the book and went together with the conference. But what we noticed was that Chomsky wouldn't play ball. He wasn't going to, even though language is biology, it's a biological organ of some kind. That's how he described it. Language is an organ in the brain. But it didn't evolve. I was thinking, how could you have an organ in the brain, a language organ? It just got there. And he literally said it just got there. It's astonishing, but it just, and the story he tells us, when he finally did get round to having to, and this is the point I'm making, my own view is that me and Jim Herford, all the rest of us, Kim was there, the first one, Robin Dunbar was there, Leslie Yellow, there was a whole bunch of us there. And what happened was that Chomsky's own friends were saying, come on, Noam, you're going to have to come up with some kind of theory. This bunch of people, Chris Knight and all those other lot, they're banging at the door demanding a theory. You're going to have to come up with a theory. We actually went down, we went to Boston for a big version, one of the coming together of this EvoLang series, which became a biannual conference series. It's still going on now, by the way. Every other year, someone in the world has an EvoLang conference. I've got a bit bored with it all, I don't do it anymore. Anyway, we had this conference in Boston, and at the very end of the conference, Noam Chomsky made an appearance. And I remember we were all in this big hall. It was, I think, 800 of us. I mean, a large number of us all in this huge hall in Boston. And we were all waiting expectantly. And back of the hall, there was a bit of a rustling. This man was coming up. Absolute silence in the hall. Chomsky gets to the microphone. You can have a theory, all kinds of theories. I can tell a fairy tale. I've got a fairy tale. You've got a fairy tale. I've got another fairy tale. For example, the fairy tale. And then he told a fairy tale. And the fairy tale he told in the sort of mumbling tones was that there was a cosmic ray shower somewhere in the distant part of the universe. And it sent all these cosmic rays over this planet when humans were just evolving. And as a result of the cosmic ray shower, there was a mutation happened in the brain of one individual. And because it's a fairy tale or a myth, he describes this person as coming up this afternoon, Prometheus. So Prometheus's brain was sort of tweaked by this cosmic ray shower. And as a result of that, formed in the brain of this one individual, in an instant, and not from any precursor, was not any old language organ, but a perfectly functioning language organ. He's quite careful, he's trying to be realistic about it and scientific. He didn't say perfect, it was almost perfect. You're thinking, oh, this organ's almost perfect. What does it mean to be almost perfect? Well, it was almost perfect meant that he could talk. But of course, because language was never social, it was only to himself. But the point was, this Prometheus, because he could think so clearly, had reproductive success. And he produced lots of babies. None of whom could talk, but all of them could think. So they weren't communicating with each other. Each individual had language privately thinking to itself, because it not sure whether it's male or female, this individual. And then, when people keep pressing, come on now, when did languages, when you're talking, he said, oh, several thousand years later, they managed to externalize language. But that's not interesting. It happened all sorts of different ways, of no interest at all. The interesting thing isn't the externalization of language, in other words, making what you're saying audible to other people. It's the appearance of this organ. And of course you might think that if this first human is talking but nobody can hear, is it really talking? Why not call it thinking? But his point is that linguistic thinking, using sort of linguistic concepts, has properties which ordinary thinking, so if you're just like any other creature, or you're a human riding a bicycle, or chopping wood, eating a meal, I mean that's not interesting, but you have a particular kind of thinking which you can only do with language, but it's still internal to your head. I don't know what you think about all that, but I mean, to describe it as nonsense seems almost an understatement. I mean, and to say that you can use language to communicate, but you can use your hairstyle, the way you walk, as if it's sort of an artificial thing to get language to actually communicate thinking, is astonishing. There was a time when all this seemed very important, because, I mean, Chomsky, most people on the left always thought of Chomsky as a kind of, a left-winger, an anarchist, philosopher, thinker, activist to some extent, anti-war activist, anti-militarist activist. Actually, I would say much more influential in places where it matters, and much more significantly, Chomsky was a scientist. Now, it's a bit difficult to call somebody a scientist if all they produce is nonsense, of course, but Chomsky was most definitely regarded as not just any scientist, but probably the most significant, interesting, frequently cited scientist. And because language is a part of being human, it meant that to a significant extent he was a scientist in the area where it matters. Like, what does it mean to be human? Well, to be human is to be able to think aloud, to communicate your thoughts, to share them, to talk. So if Chomsky's science homes in on what it really means to be human, then of course to some extent he's crossed over from the domain of external nature, from astronomy and biology and geology and all those things, into something which affects us all. And that's how he was regarded. The science was like somehow special, because through what he called the study of language, he got to delving deep into the very nature of mind itself. You're into mind. And then, of course, you have this development following the Second World War, the onset of the Cold War, where in opposition to Marxist materialism, which obviously prioritizes body, I mean, we absolutely have a mind, all humans have minds. A little bit difficult to say that a chimpanzee doesn't have a mind of its own, it's kind of a mentality, mind, linked up obviously with brain. But Chomsky was somehow hegemonic because his science was natural science, and natural science, as everybody knows, is like proper science, it's not social science, it's all kinds of versions of politics. But his natural science was natural science which impinged on what it means to be human. And when you ask, well, exactly what does it mean to be human, he would usually use the term creativity. Other creatures are somehow determined, external stimuli shape the behavior of other animals, but somehow humans have a kind of creativity, a kind of freedom, thanks to language, and that turns into, of course, a mind-first philosophy. Now, mind-first philosophy was all over the place in the 60s and 70s. So Claude Lévi-Strauss, he was interested in the innate architecture of the human mind. He explained myths and fairy tales. His magnum opus was, of course, a huge work, 4-volume work on the world's mythology, North and South American mythology. And his argument was that mythology, because it's the mind idly communing with itself, the mind is just daydreaming, talking to itself. It's not like other things we humans do. When we do other things, we're doing it to survive. It's something to do with economics, or maybe it's to do with demography. There's all sorts of external causes impinging on the patterns that things take. But when it's mind, that's different. Mind is sort of sui generis. It's coming out of itself. And so you have this idealism, this idea that the mind comes first and then secondarily shapes thought, but then as a result of shaping thought, it then shapes action as well, and maybe shapes politics. And it's a bit strange because Chomsky, the political activist, the anarchist, didn't have that view. He was very well aware that in politics, they need to raise the costs, for example, of the US invasion of Vietnam, the protests, the mutinies, and the support, of course, for the Viet Cong, which is he was good at, went to North Vietnam very bravely. I'm just getting to the point of saying there are two known Chomskys, and one of them is actually quite sensible. The anarchist was relatively sensible about causality. I would say pretty much unerringly accurate about which side to take in different political conflicts. Clearly when it came to Israel and Palestine, he was admirably principled. Many things about Noam Chomsky, the activist, that were admirable, and which we today, now that Chomsky's not quite gone, but I'm afraid very much gone, we miss Noam Chomsky. He's a very lovely, wonderful, principled figure on the landscape. But there were always two Chomskys, and the other Chomsky, the so-called scientific Chomsky, wasn't materialist at all, completely idealist. So mind comes first. But where does it come from? Where does mind come from? In the course of human origins, human evolution, where does the mind come from? And the point is that everything he's ever said about the mind and where it came from is that it came from nothing. It didn't come from any precursor. The human mind is just emerged from sort of, as I say, this cosmic ray shower. So really very strange. And then to keep his whole mode of thinking sort of consistent, you get a whole lot of other stuff. So what about concepts? They're called lexical concepts. You might call them words, but if you think about a word, think of the word carburettor. There's the sound, carburettor, vowels and consonants, but leave that aside. Think of however it's pronounced, whatever language you're speaking in. We all, these days, I think, have the concept of carburettor. So leave out the sound, just have the concept. It can't be an evolution, because Chomsky doesn't like evolution, and evolution, Darwinism, won't deal with it at all. It must have emerged in an instant, but it didn't come from learning, because he doesn't like learning either, because learning means culture, and culture means all sorts of things which aren't, in his view, scientific. So carburettor must always have existed as a concept. So the concept of carburettor existed before the wheel had been invented, never mind the internal combustion engine. And then all sorts of other concepts. Another one he came up with was bureaucrat. Bureaucrat is a timeless concept. It's been the concept of a bureaucrat before there was writing. How can you have bureaucrats without writing? What bureaucrats do is they write. They might produce death sentences, for example, or property contracts or something. I think, as far as I can work out, without writing, you're not going to have bureaucrats. No. Bureaucrats go back to the earliest part of the Stone Age. Bureaucrat, carburettor, these things are timeless concepts. What have I left out that Chomsky says? Anyway, so, just kind of What is so strange is that this was, for nearly half a century, this, I think you'd all agree, complete nonsense. I mean, unmitigated, unadulterated nonsense was regarded as not just kind of science in general, but almost like the supreme science. I mean, Chomsky was cited more frequently than any other intellectual, actually more frequently cited both in the arts and the humanities. He was cited for political reasons, his political activism and insights, but also as a scientist, he was constantly, he was cited in almost anything to do, any discussion, debate, article to do with computation. So an event termed in the literature, everywhere, called the cognitive revolution. It means the inauguration of a specialized study of cognition. The cognitive revolution. When did scientists first start to study mind in a scientific way? Well, it's through this revolution, which was inaugurated by Noam Chomsky. So by the way, it's just in archaeology, it's anthropology, and I don't know, so many different sciences. The cognitive revolution had this huge effect. So the study of rock art, for example, most people who study rock art have studied it within what's called a sort of cognitive framework. And that is a sort of spin-off of this thing called the cognitive revolution, which privileges or prioritizes the concept of cognition or mind. And art is one thing, among many other things, which emerges as particular patterns art assumes as reflections of the very nature of mind that Chomsky's work is bringing to light and clarifying for us all. Not quite so relevant these days. And the reason for the fact that it's all pretty much collapsed, this whole massive sort of edifice where, I mean, you couldn't argue with Chomsky. One of the metaphors I use is, for Chris and I to argue with Noam Chomsky is like me arguing with a king. I mean, I'm not the king, he is the king. And therefore, the king, if I argue with the king, he's always going to win the argument. Because, why? Because he's the king. It was very similar with Noam Chomsky. I just found I couldn't actually, it doesn't matter how many conferences I went to, and I said more or less what I've said to you. In other words, that all this stuff done is absolute nonsense. Sometimes Noam Chomsky would walk off the stage because I was just there. That happened quite often, actually. And then I'd find that my paper, and the paper, say, Luke Steele's and various other colleagues of mine, which had all submitted to this conference, they wouldn't get published. Because if the publishers had published our papers, Noam Chomsky wouldn't have published his. And they really had to have Noam Chomsky as a #1 selling point of the whole book. So you just couldn't argue with Noam Chomsky. But it was kind of mad. It's just, I don't know any other word. And yet I was sincerely, genuinely making a big effort in the early years to get my head around it all so I could write about the thing. As it happens, it wasn't until I finished this book. When was I finished this book? I finished it in 2016, the hardback, and 2018, the paperback. Decoding Chomsky, Science and Revolutionary Politics. It's a very nice book, I hope you'll all buy it. It goes through the whole history of Chomsky's work, but more, in some ways, to recover that history, to describe what happened, is to sort of decode the 20th century. Because Chomsky was central to 20th century thinking, and his own thinking in the 20th century was already a kind of reaction to the pre-war period, which was so heavily influenced by Marx. I mean, there was a time around the 30s and perhaps 40s and 50s, nearly all historians, any serious historian, they weren't politically Marxist, they weren't all that consistently Marxist, but I mean, Marx was overwhelmingly the influence on anyone who wanted to get anywhere as a historian. So Marxism was really influential on a certain academic level. Not quite the Marxism that we would celebrate here, but still, huge influence of Marx, because of course Durkheim was himself not a Marxist, of course. He got rid of the concept of conflict and contradiction, very strange, stodgy, mushy, uniform version of Marxist material. But still, anyway, now I should move on, otherwise I'll be half an hour's got already. Right. Jeffrey Epstein. It's hard to know what to say. Perhaps I'll be quite effective to just read out a few things. I mean, what I'm going to be describing to you is the way in which Chomsky just went up in a puff of smoke. I mean, Chomsky is just gone, I'm afraid. It's a shame in many ways. We do miss him. There's aspects of Chomsky's activism and understanding of the Middle East and world politics which are irreplaceable. No better book than some of these Fateful Triangle and various other books. He's gone. So I'm going to read out a few things from here. This is Epstein writing in 2015. I should say, by the way, that this book here, it was kind of written by Chris Knight, but one or two critical parts of it, critical chapters, was written by somebody sitting in the front row here. Mark, he's putting his hand up. And unlike me, I was raised as a Trotskyist, Sussex University, the militant tendency. I never felt any need for Noam Chomsky politically. I just, what on earth? I mean, yes, he's a nice liberal. As a liberal, he's pretty damn good. Unusually good, actually. But I didn't feel any succour, any theoretical, nourishment coming from that direction from Noam Chomsky. But I know that Mark, he's certainly not the only one. Many people of that generation, a little bit younger than me, I think most of them. What was it about Chomsky which was so attractive? I think it's just that he was so convincingly sane, knowledgeable, of course, therefore authoritative. When Chomsky talked about what the US is doing, military are doing in, I don't know, any part of the world really, somehow Chomsky spoke with knowledge. You could believe what he said. He didn't make extravagant claims, he didn't understate or overstate, and it was good stuff. It was clarifying, enlightening, even if, I would say, descriptive, not really very theoretical. He didn't believe in, he believed you need theory for linguistics, but you really need theory for politics. And so he was a very important part of the left, including Mark here. And of course, Mark helped me a lot with some of the more complicated, difficult political episodes when Chomsky was, all right, the main theme of this whole book is as follows. There are two Noam Chomskys. Chomsky is not a person. Chomsky is two different people. How can I say he's two different people? Well, we've got on the one hand, the #1 world's best known anti-militarist activist. His name is Noam Chomsky. This Noam Chomsky, the great anti-militarist activist, has spent his whole life working for, guess what? The US military. He's been working in a military laboratory in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. What was he doing there? Why was he employed? You can oversimplify, and I'm in danger of doing that sometimes. The US military wanted a very clever weapon. They'd already got a clever weapon through the Manhattan Project. They managed to crack the atom and made an atom bomb and dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They wanted a different kind of weapon. What they wanted were bombers and missiles, or rather they wanted the guidance systems of these bombers and missiles, which would be very easy. They would be highly complicated computational mechanisms, which would be very easy for maybe rather stupid people, certain generals, to use. So the image I have, which is a bit of an oversimplification, is that you'd be a general and you're in the middle of a nuclear war, you'll all be in some underground bunker, and you want to make sure that the missiles you send back to Moscow reach their target. And so instead of having to use complicated digital computer machinery, you just talk, and you use whatever language is yours. So you just say, hit them communists, or if it's the Vietnam War, hit them Viet Cong, go right, no, go left, you idiot. And you just talk to the missile, and the missile has got inside it. This is all a bit of a metaphor, it's much more complicated than this. But inside the missile, in the nose cone perhaps, is, guess what, a black box, almost like a language organ, for computing, not for talking. The missiles don't talk to each other. You give them an input, and they produce an output after doing this computational, complicated stuff. And the output is to just aim at the right, at the right target. So instead of having to use complicated machinery, you just use language. But remember, the language is not conversational. And by the way, you do not, when you're talking to a rocket or a missile, telling them where to drop their bomb, what you do not want to use is metaphor. You don't want to speak to your missile in metaphorical language. It's got to be literal. And then what you begin to realize is that all those strange things about language which Chomsky comes up with. I mean, for example, I was at a conference in Reading, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I asked him about metaphor. And his Chomsky answer from the platform, a metaphor is a deviant expression. So unless your language is literal, nobody actually uses literal language anyway. It's almost impossible to use language which is just Dalek style, vowels and consonants meaning particular things, like when you press a keyboard. If you press the keyboard and you press the T, you can't sort of infer to the computer, I really meant T or J. You press, T. But Chomsky's version of linguistics is literal in that sense. Nothing symbolic, nothing deep, no figure of speech, absolutely no poetry. If you're talking to a missile, don't use poetry. Just say it straight. But the point about that is that that's actually not how language works. All language is metaphorical, at least in origin. Any simple word, I don't know, screw the neck with a bottle. Neck. Has a bottle got earlobes? Has it got nipples? Has it got, yes, of course bottles can have nipples. Maybe it can have a nipple. So I'm just saying, almost everything we think about, we can say, in some way or other, it's a metaphor, it's been shifted. And what matters as you speak is your communicative intention, not the exact, not the literal sign. So anyway, what I've worked out, and I'm going to come to Epstein in a moment, what I've worked out is that all the peculiar, bizarre features that Chomsky ascribes to language work for a mainframe computer, like a 50s or 60s style huge computer. Those computers in those days, they used to generate so much heat, you had to have a whole big cooling system with a big building to keep the computer in. That computer doesn't talk to other computers. It's not like modern artificial intelligence. It doesn't scamper around, it doesn't outwit other computers. It's just a huge big object into which comes some input, information input, and out of which comes an output. But hopefully his idea was, this is what the US military wanted, they could reduce, it would take many generations, but reduce these huge big things called computers into relatively small things you could put into a nose cone of a missile, or into the complicated computational equipment carried up by a B-52 bomber or something. Right, I'm going to move on. And I might have to ask Mark to come in now. In 2009, I remember this quite vividly, Noam Chomsky's wife, lifelong friend and partner and wife, Carol, died of a brain tumour. It took about a year to kill her. Noam was by her side throughout that difficult period. It took a while before Chomsky felt able to form another relationship. A few years later, he formed a relationship with a Brazilian woman. I think she'd been his secretary, or had some work. No, sorry, not his secretary, sorry. Okay, anyway, he formed a relationship with Valeria. Sorry, Mark, say it louder.
She'd been a translator, I think, on one of his trips, something like that. They weren't working together, but...
They weren't working together primarily, but he'd been a translator on one of his trips. And they formed a relationship, a very happy relationship for Noam. He couldn't stop, whenever he mentioned her, just describing her in such wonderfully tender, loving terms about this relationship. Which then led to problems. I don't know how much we want to go into the problems, but there are family problems because Valeria wanted, I would say probably deserved, some of the income which Chomsky had been getting from mostly from his political work, by the way. His political work gave him far more money than his scientific work. He didn't sell very many linguistic books, they were impossible to read. But all these books about the Middle East, and Vietnam, and all those things, they made a significant amount of money, most of which had previously gone to his 3 children, including Harry, his son. But now Valeria wanted some of it, and this created huge family arguments. And then Valeria, on one occasion, she accused Harry, his son, of acting like a Nazi. They got really very bitter. And Chomsky began to need sort of help and advice with his finances. I'll skip quite quickly now to 2015. This is Jeffrey Epstein. Email revealed, I think, last winter. Chomsky and I in love affair. The correspondence between Noam Chomsky and Jeffrey Epstein is extraordinarily quantifiable, voluminous. There's lots and lots of emails going to and from, far more emails than most of the other shady, creepy academics, characters getting various assistance, including money, of course, to their departments from this awful guy Novak, who had a whole lot of theories about language being a natural thing that just evolved. All sorts of people. Jeffrey Epstein made a point of giving funding to scientists and their departments. But somehow the correspondence with Chomsky, what seems to be the case is that Epstein, in order to clean up his extremely grubby sexual image, wanted to have a whole bunch of very prestigious scientists backing him up and saying what good work he's always been doing. And to do that, he didn't give them personally money exactly, but he gave money to their projects in their university departments. Valeria was one of those who was really very keen on making the most of this source of funding for her husband, coming from Jeffrey Epstein. And she wrote to Epstein, "You're constantly with us in spirit and in our thoughts, deep and sincere and everlasting friendship." Now that was Chomsky, sorry, "You're constantly with us in spirit and in our thoughts," as Noam. Valeria, I'm just picking up bits of email. I don't know whether it's a good thing to do, whether I could let Mark do it. I mean, Mark's far more knowledgeable about all these emails. I mean, Mark, I think he's the only person in the world who's actually had the stamina to rummage through these huge amounts of emails to find out what was really going on with the fact that eventually Chomsky just got into bed with Epstein in many ways, really very, very close. I mean, Chomsky would describe his intellectual discussions with Jeffrey Epstein as the most exciting and vibrant, thrilling debates and discussions he's ever had in his life.
Because the PowerPoint, those 5 or 6 slides,
okay, what we're going to do now, thank you. Okay, right, what we're going to do now, we're going to ask, let me read it out. Chomsky and Epstein met on 30 occasions, mainly with Chomsky's new book, Library. And Mark wants you, and I want you as well, to think about these questions. To what extent was Chomsky, we got to choices now, it's a multiple choice question. Complicit with Epstein? Was he complicit? Was he manipulated by him? Or was he in denial about Epstein? What's the answer? All of them. All of them. All right, Mark, what do you think of that? He's complicit, he was manipulated by him. Yeah, I think it's right. I think I would agree with that. All. Next slide, please. Right, Chomsky to Lawrence Krauss. Right. Lawrence Krauss is quite an important scientist, and And Chomsky told this guy Krauss about the very first meeting he'd had at this ranch. Where was the ranch? In Mexico somewhere, was it? New Mexico? And then Chomsky, my favourite person to debate ever was Jeffrey. So they're having a lovely time, Noam and Jeffrey. Epstein to Valeria about Noam's financial dispute with his children, as I just mentioned a moment ago. Epstein says, you can count on me to structure and maintain any solution you two agree on. Valeria replies, we count you as our best friend, I mean the one. So what Epstein was doing, it wasn't quite as bad as you might think. It wasn't, he was piling money over to Chomsky's kids or to Chomsky himself either, but he was very clever at extricating the money from savings, I don't know, whatever you call them. But Chomsky was finding it difficult to extract the money from where he put it, and Epstein managed to extricate it. And in response to that, Valeria replies, we count you as our best friend. I mean, the one. So I'm just saying, not any old friendship, the best. And Chomsky says to a student interviewer, me too is, what's happening today? Can we move up? Can we move the computer up? Can we just move it up a bit? Otherwise we're missing something.
The bottom. Can you see the bottom of that?
Yes,
it's not there.
For some reason it says, Me Too is a very healthy development.
Me Too is a very healthy development. Okay, well that's one perspective. Me Too is a very healthy development, yeah. And then go on, next one then please. Oh well, it has actually moved on to another whole topic. Right, anyway, so I work with two linguists on a book called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, what was it, 50 Years On, published in 2018. And yes, he responds to my book chapter by concluding, what is striking is the unfailing regularity with which Knight's vulgar exercises of defamation crash to the ground on a moment's inquiry. I apologise for wasting time and space on this performance. In the book, this collection of essays, with me, he draws a line under what he's writing, so that he's not writing against me in the book. He's writing sort of under the under the bottom margin of the book, so that he doesn't sort of I don't know, defile himself with anything to do with this horrible guy called Chris Knight. And these are just, you know, I think these are just, yes, November the 28th. Well, these are things happening in 2018. Okay, so the conference that I was organising in UCL on Noam Chomsky, saying some of the things I'd already worked out about what Chomsky was up to in working for the military while working against it at the same time. This book came out, and we had a conference on it at the same time as Chomsky was writing to Epstein. It's one of the great experiences of my life to have you as a friend, and to remain so and cherish this permanent relationship. So there's Noam and Epstein on Epstein's private jet, going off somewhere. Let's move on. Yes, next one, please. Yeah, so this is the £250,000 he had got from the trust. I don't know quite how these things all connect up. I suppose Mark's just helping me to sort of make sure my dates are more or less correct. So anyway, Chomsky advises Epstein on how to deal with the kind of attacks this horrible person Chris Knight has been making against Chomsky. How do you deal with these terrible attacks? I've had plenty of experience with defamation, so my stuff is defamation. I thought I was always being very respectful of Noam. I didn't call him names. I said he'd been working for the US military because, yeah, he'd been working for the US military and admitted himself on numerous occasions. But he says, there are books, articles, websites devoted to denouncing me in the most vicious terms. Just use his advice, just stay above the furore, wait it out, go on with what matters, like real friendship, deep and sincere and everlasting from both of us. I'm sort of asking you to sort of just internalize those words. And then Epstein texts Steve Bannon. Now this just gets kind of beyond it. I mean, Steve Bannon, he's like the #1 most famous, most, in some ways, from the point of view of the far right, celebrated Nazi activist friend of Donald Trump. What? So anyway, Epstein texts Steve Bannon about a film, and the film is being made with Leon Chomsky in order to big up Epstein as this great friend of science. But also, Epstein was fantasizing about getting into one room, the Dalai Lama, Woody Allen, and Noam Chomsky. So all these, so Epstein had this vision of sailing the skin, cleaning up his image by being the sort of centre of this, I don't know, sort of globe of hugely famous, prominent figures. And the next one seems to have gone as well. What's that one saying?
What it says, it's December the 29th. This is Bannon to Epstein talking about this film. I would make a 3-hour for Netflix. This was Bannon's plan. He's already made another documentary for Netflix.
Bannon was busy making, with Epstein's support and supposedly with Chomsky's pledge that he would have as well, a film called The End of Patriarchy. Now, Bannon's worst fear was the Me Too movement. He said, I'm warning all of you, this is the end of patriarchy. These women are getting too powerful. They're beginning to destroy, of course, various horrible creeps that are involved in rape and stuff. But for him, Bannon, you need to defend ourselves against that. And what really gets more than puzzling is partly that Chomsky was just about to get involved in making this film, doing an interview for it. But more than that, and I think I might even have the quote if it's not on the screen, is the thing about, yes, this is Chomsky to Epstein. So we had a little thing earlier on. Chomsky saying the Me Too movement is very positive development. And then what does Chomsky say privately to Epstein? The hysteria that has developed about the abuse of women, which has reached the point that even questioning a charge is a crime worse than murder. So Chomsky's denouncing the Me Too movement because these women are complaining about being harassed or even raped. And then they're making a film. So, okay, right. So, all right, Chomsky to Epstein. What the vultures dearly want is a public response. The response to this, he's already been imprisoned for child sex. What the vultures dearly want, is a public response which then provides a public opening for venomous attacks which are impossible to answer. That's particularly true now with the hysteria that has developed about the abuse of women, which has reached the point that even questioning a charge is a crime worse than murder. And then a little bit later, Epstein says to Steve Bannon, do you think the end of patriarchy should be the working title? Bannon replies, smart. And then we heard that Epstein to Bannon is Chomsky saying, when is this film going to be made? I mean, why would Chomsky ask when the film's going to be made if he wasn't interested? And of course, the inference is that he was about to be interviewed for this film. I have to say, I can't quite believe that Chomsky, if he'd known what the film was about, would have happily denounced women in those terms and warned against the end of patriarchy. But I mean, it's up to you to decide. I find it difficult to read that, I must say. That's a step too far, but it's looking shabby. Next one, please. Oh yes, so and of course it doesn't look very good when he's asked by all sorts of newspapers, Noam, what do you say to all this? And he says, it's none of your business. Next one, please. And then, of course, Valeria, that's Epstein on the right there, that's Valeria in the middle, that's down here. So Valeria had to make a statement very recently, early this year, because it was all getting so shocking. And she says that having been to various islands and ranches and stuff on Epstein's private plane, we never witnessed any inappropriate, criminal or reproachable behaviour from Epstein. Always supported gender equality and women's rights. What happened was that, this is putting all the blame on Epstein, of course, what happened was that Epstein took advantage of Noam's public criticism towards what came to be known as cancel culture, to present himself as a victim of it. So the problem wasn't these women in the Me Too movement, it was this sort of other thing called cancel culture. And then only, Vele is trying to say, only after Epstein's second arrest did the full truth come out. Next slide, I just want to see what slides are here. Yes, so yes, this is kind of an interesting thought, really. Camilla and I, we know Robert Trivers quite sort of fairly well in the sense that we've had him speak. He's part of our sort of intellectual milieu. He's a self-esteem theorist. He wasn't like Sarah Hrdy, an expert in humans and hominins and primates. His specialist field was lizards, which I suppose has got some relevance to humans. But anyway, one of the lovely things that Trivers did was write a book about how easy it is to deceive one particular person, namely yourself. You are the person that's most easily deceived by you. And I remember we were at a conference when he was, what was that terrible spacecraft crash that led to all the death of all the pilots. Challenger, that's right. Yes, thank you. And he gave a lovely lecture on how the self-deception of the technicians and scientists telling themselves that everything was fine when they actually knew that there was a terrible flaw in this rocket and it almost certainly would crash. So, I mean, I'm just saying, Trivers was an expert on self-deception.
And he had in the past worked with Huey Newton, the Black Panther,
yes,
to learn about this issue of deception.
Yes, so Robert Trivers was in some ways a left-winger, a sort of Black Panther supporter, a friend of Huey Newton, a bit of an anarchist as well, rather unreliable in his politics, going zigzagging around a bit. But a very, very extremely significant figure. He wrote a wonderful book, the classic book on social evolution, explaining all sorts of paradoxes in evolution, like why do you have death? You don't have to have death. You could even, some certain kinds of moss and fungi and stuff, they live more or less forever. So why do you have death? Why do you have sex? Why do you have so many different things? A beautiful book in a self-achieving framework. So Chomsky's conversation with Robert Trivers, that's obviously those two are neither of them. It's Epstein and Trivers, nothing to do with Chomsky. Okay, next one, The Folly of Fools.
Just to say, Chris, that while writing the book on self-deception, Epstein is funding Trivers. The irony in this.
I hadn't quite loved that paradox. Yeah. And this is just, I mean, Chomsky complains that I make some comments about Jerome Wiesler, Chomsky's boss. If you read Chomsky's reply to me in that book, Responsibility of Intellectuals, Chomsky makes out that this guy Wiesler, his boss, who was running MIT in the period when Chomsky got his job, Chomsky was given his job by this guy Wiesler. He was Lyndon B. Johnson's #1 scientist advisor, and mad keen on nuclear weapons. He was the author of the whole idea of building up these huge stocks of nuclear weapons. And what else? He wasn't a peace stick. But you read Chomsky on Wiesler, and because there was a certain point where Wiesler thought, we've got enough weapons, we need to make sure that they work and maybe not have quite so many of them. He was trying to make out, in response to me, that this guy, his boss, was actually a peace advocate. And this is, of course, during the Vietnam War. Okay, next one. And this is a colleague of his, just describing this Wiesler was. He was soaked in military problems. Since 1942, he's had a hand in submarine warfare, air defence, atom bombs, guerrilla warfare, civil defence, psychological warfare, and he himself boasted, I helped get the United States ballistic missile program established in the face of strong opposition from the civilian and military leaders of the Air Force and Departments of Defence. All the point I'm making here is that Chomsky was close to this guy. So Chomsky himself is an anti-militarist, anti-war activist, who's a close friend and colleague of the main militarists, if you like, in the States at the time, the person advising Lyndon B. Johnson. Next one, please. Yes, so Chomsky got really angry with me for suggesting that he worked in a military laboratory and said there was no military work conducted on campus. And yet he says in 1987, I've been in an electronics laboratory for the last 30 years. He tries to make out this because Jerome Wiesner was willing to take a chance on some odd ideas. And then he says, where's the hardware of the machine? These quotes here, I should have framed this a bit better. These are quotes from Chomsky designed to make it seem that military work was neither here nor there. It was just some odd ideas, mainly to do what I felt like. It was just encouraging innovative, strange people with odd ideas. And the Pentagon was the best funder ever. They didn't care what you were doing. This is Chomsky right up until recently, 2022, arguing against me, very largely actually, to say that military work wasn't important, you could do whatever you liked. And he was doing, you know. Next one, please. I don't know why that's there. Next one, please. Right, okay. Yes, so this is important, which again Mark discovered. Okay, there was one sort of building, a kind of adjunct or offshoot of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, not far away, called the MITRE Corporation, in another place, Bedford. And it was in this particular corporation, MITRE, that theory was translated into practice. So any ideas that Chomsky had for how to make this extraordinary computer machinery to be able to guide nuclear weapons, if it was to be turned into something which actually worked for the US military, it would have to be done at the MITRE Corporation. And Chomsky's friends, they say, yeah, but Chomsky never went to the MITRE Corporation. No, you know, he was just doing academic stuff, theoretical stuff. He wouldn't have done anything practical. Consultants, N. Chomsky. and it's absolutely clear here that in the MITRE Corporation, they were trying to experiment with using Chomsky's ideas about what language is to manufacture these computational systems of missile guidance. So this paper, the result of one of these special studies, is in the area of mathematical formalizations in our development of a program to establish natural language as an operational language for command and control. Do you get what that means? Natural language, if you're English, it means English. And how can you use English, just ordinary English, to control the missiles? That was the problem which Chomsky was employed in the MITRE Corporation, where they make things, to do. Next one, please. And this is Chomsky's student, Lieutenant J. Kaiser. He was an Air Force lieutenant, and he was using Chomsky's methods as part of the Air Force to guide these bombers, but also missiles, in this case, B-58s. So Chomsky says it's nothing to do with the military. These are the sample sentences. Planes fly sorties. Planes are B-58s. Planes are on bases. B-58s will refuel. B-58s must be on base. These are the sample sentences used at MIT and MITRE to test whether Chomsky's theories work. So there's no question, from the point of view of Wiesner and the military, the whole point of Chomsky being there was to use his knowledge of language so that English could be used, or any other language actually, could be used as a weapons command and control system. Next one, please. That's right, and then Mark asked me to do something which I wouldn't normally have thought of doing. He said, why don't you write to one of Chomsky's students? There's a woman called Barbara Party. Asked what she thought she was doing in MITRE. And then she wrote back to me a lovely long email, very, very supportive. And she says that in the event of a nuclear war, the generals will be underground with some computers trying to manage things, and it would probably be easier to teach computers to understand English than to teach the generals to program. So I thought it was a lovely sentence from her. But again, just shows exactly what was really going on. Next one, please. Oh yeah, right. Okay, so he's asked, how about Chris Knight? I can't quite remember where this was. You connect your theory of language to Pentagon-funded work you did at MIT during the Cold War. This is Chomsky's reply. the Pentagon was the means by which the government carried out industrial policy and developed the high-tech economy of the future. MIT was almost entirely funded by the military, including the music department. Does this mean you were doing military work? He's more or less saying, what's wrong with music? There was a study in '69, the Pounds Commission. I was a member of it. Ah, right, I'm a member of it. To investigate whether any military or classified work was being done on campus. Answer, none. Another lovely quote which Mark found for me was that maybe not quite the same year, Chomsky had to admit none of the military work was done on campus, but it was done 4 inches off campus. You know how you do that? You just draw a line, a little dotted line around the map to make it that technically this is off campus, whereas this is on campus. I mean, what chicanery. And then, okay, yes, and I was just saying, what I was saying, perhaps I should just say, I'm not of any great significance, but suddenly Chris Knight became famous last February, actually. I'd written this book, nobody took much notice of it. And then I was interviewed by Owen Jones and by Novara Media and Counterpunch and all the usual Aeon magazine and all sorts of things. Suddenly everyone was talking about Chris Knight. Honestly, on my Wikipedia page, the hits went from like right up to an incredible number of hits. And why? Because Chris Knight can explain the Epstein stuff. In what sense? And in some ways I kept saying, I can't really explain it, but I can say it was nothing new for Chomsky to take a known criminal, somebody that he himself regarded as a criminal, and then turn him into his best friend. Okay, John Deutsch. He was a specialist in MIT in all kinds of nuclear weaponry, but in particular in biological weaponry. And then Chomsky votes for him to be president of MIT. Nobody else, even these military scientists, thought it was too much to actually vote for this horrible war criminal. And then, so yeah, Chomsky says he wrote about how he voted for him and what kind of lovely guy this John Deutsch was. He was more honesty and integrity than anyone had ever met in academic life or any other life. If somebody's going to be running the CIA, I'm glad it's him. I mean, it's just extraordinary, isn't it? So, next one, please. And then, I mean, this is just a rather moving statement, and I'll move now to sort of another, striking another note, I suppose. Just before he died, his last political article of 2023, not died, sort of died. I mean, he's had a terrible stroke, and no one quite knows whether he's sort of partly alive or partly not alive, but he's certainly gone from the world. And I mean, you can read that if you like. It's a beautiful example of Noam Chomsky at his finest. Ukraine has been devastated, the threat of escalation to nuclear war intensifies. Perhaps worst of all, in terms of long-term consequences, the meager efforts to address global heating have been largely reversed. Some are doing fine. US military and fossil fuel industries are drowning in profit with great prospects for emissions and destruction many years ahead. Meanwhile, scarce resources that are desperately needed to salvage a livable world, to create a much better one, have been wasted in destruction and slaughter and planning for even greater catastrophes. So, I mean, very moving. We do miss him. And what an extraordinary tragedy. It's very hard to think of a Greek tragedy more deeply distressing. I think it's just gargantuan in the scale of this tragedy that is. And of course, I don't know, somehow I used to think of Chomsky, the sort of scientist, as somehow disconnected from politics and everything else. I mean, it's like one Chomsky completely disconnected from another. And it's almost as if the thinking Chomsky and the activist Chomsky, there's sort of two sides of it, sort of different like vials in a laboratory. So, of course, one of the metaphors I use is the idea of a brain in a vat. In this book, actually, this terrible story about an air crash. You know, somebody's rescuing this person he nearly killed in a crash, and they managed to get his brain, and his brain's just unable to do anything, but it can still think. And yeah, when I think of Chomsky now, I mean, Valeria does say that he knows what's going on, he still watches television, we can't do anything about it. A really terrible, terrible tragedy. How could it be that it all ended like this?
Thank you, Chris. Very, very interesting. We'll now have some time for discussion. If people want to speak, and please indicate to speak. First, John.
Thanks for your contribution, both contributions today, excellent. My remarks are not really addressed to anybody in this room today, because I think you as individuals rise above it, and you know, you've grasped this concept long before I have. It's actually aimed at some of our broad friends out there, the broad left, and people for, you know, God help them, who are trying to make sense of the world through the social media. How I describe myself, I see myself as a cynic really in a lot of ways. And what you were describing in terms of the academic work, I would put under sort of pop academia, in the sense that actual academics who actually have qualifications but who write pop academic stuff. And I would see that it's quite typical, or even general. Certainly in what would you call mainstream history stuff that's being published, you know, it's all dreadful. And you could also say the basic old argument that even a bad theory, you know, it can get you thinking, and it can help your thought process. But the broader point I wanted to make, and I think it's an important issue to get out on the left, is that, you know, when you're dealing with people who really have been disgraced or whatever, you know, are you saying that when you take some of the possible good work on the political theory and the political debates, that you never quote them again? You don't read them again. You don't encourage other people to read them. You don't say a particular debate or a particular chapter was good. Like the social media thing is so much that it's the latest hate. The hate of the week is Chomsky this week. It's somebody else next week. And it's almost as we can't read any of their stuff in the future. You know, our eyes will burn or something. So it goes back to art as well. And I finished at this. You know, where do you draw the line? I mean, technically, you know, should we read Lord Byron? Should we read Percy Shelley? I mean, you could make the argument that they had terrible, you know, reputations and so forth. So it's not really for us here, but I think it's a guide to the broad left and so forth, that there's some of these things we have to avoid the idea of, you know, burning the books, as it were. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know which bit is which, so I'm talking to that one? Okay. As I keep telling people with boring regularity, I used to be a teacher, and I taught English and history. And one of the plays I always loved was King Lear.
Oh, yeah.
One of the reasons, oh yeah. I think as people get older, they find Lear more and more useful. One of the things about Lear is that towards the end, he comes full circle, and he realizes that he's been a fool, amongst other things. And I remember I did a master's in linguistics. Don't ask me when, because I'm not good on dates. We spent an entire year studying Chomsky, an entire bloody year. And I remember at the end of the year, I was absolutely none the wiser. I think I passed the exam because I wrote down what I was told, but not what I understood, because I didn't understand anything. And in fact, our professor, who was a lovely linguist, whose his area of expertise was the Basque language, he wrote a scathing, sarcastic essay called The Car Park Theory of Language, which was a take on Chomsky. It was absolutely wonderful. It was published in some kind of Festschrift or other, which I... and the thing that I remember was that we had in this group an older gentleman from North Vietnam, and we were talking about metaphor. We were sitting around having tea, and we were trying to come to grips with metaphor and Chomsky. And this guy lifted the teapot, and he wanted to pour tea for us, and he said with a smile, "Shall I be a mother?" We tried not to laugh, but it was very difficult. For people who do not have an English background, which of course I do many years. Usually in the olden days, mother poured the tea, but it was shall I be mother rather than shall I be a mother, which is a little bit difficult to be if you're a man. Okay, notwithstanding. I remember going through the Vietnam era and saying to people, ignore Chomsky's linguistics, concentrate on his politics. Not that I was a great fan, but he did say some very good things. And people would look at me and say, but how can we ignore his work? And I would say, ignore it. I'm really pleased to hear what you had to say today. You have made my entire study of that worthwhile, so thank you.
Thank you. One question we got online from Mike is how is Chomsky's work connected to today's large language models, LLMs? These chatbots appear to be quite close to what he was aiming to accomplish. Next I got Jim.
Enjoyed that. I've read Decoding Chomsky after I bought it. I'll have to buy your language book for it. I've also read, among many others, Manufacturer Consent, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
But when it came out about Epstein, seeing his picture in the paper and stuff, I thought that bloke looks like a creep. But then I thought, he look like a creep because I know he's a creep? Is there such a thing? But I guess he's a psychopath, insofar as that's now...
Epstein. Talking about Epstein.
Yeah, sorry. Insofar as that's now a category, mixture of charm and threat. How were people fooled? Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, of course, money. Blinded by the light. But others, there are lots of others with far more money than Epstein, Bill Gates. But I was fooled by Jerry Healy for 11 years, member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party. I thought he was a great bloke. And deceiving myself. And abuse of women, it was when the news came out about abuse of women, lots of witnesses, in other words, and that's been the downfall of lots of people, isn't it? Not all, but every few days in the papers you see a religious leader or a teacher or somebody or other, maybe 20 years ago or more. But when it happened with Jerry Healy, for instance, all the walls came down, all the walls came tumbling down. What about this, that and the other? Going back, what I've believed in the past didn't work for everybody, of course. There are some still at it. But anyway, that's it for now. Thank you.
Next item, Marcus.
Thank you. Couple of things, thank you. A lot of people say to me, because I'm in the Labor Party in Australia, they say, oh, how can you stop yourself being disillusioned in the Labor Party? I always say, well, the trick is never be illusioned in the Labor Party. And I kind of feel the same about Chomsky. I never saw the attraction or the interest in his ideas, sure. And I think he's an interesting figure to study, but he's trying to look for consistency in Chomsky is kind of futile. I don't think he was a consistent thinker. He's a woolly liberal, sure. He was against the Vietnam War and he was against militarism, but you know, he had all. But he was like a moth to a flame. He liked being the public intellectual. He was attracted to the powerful were attracted to him. So I'm not that. I think that's it. And he was completely inconsistent even on the things he was meant to be consistent on. So he supported the US invasion of Haiti in 1994. He also supported the NATO in the Balkans after the collapse of with the Dayton Accords. And he said on this, suppose I had been in Congress, let's say, and had been asked to choose between exactly two alternatives. One, let them keep massacring one another. Two, put in US troops to separate the warring armies, ... If those are the two choices, I probably would have voted for sending in the troops. And there's Chomsky in the 90s. And so I don't think there's looking for consistency there. I think it's interesting. He's almost like a left-wing Rasputin in the US area. Where I do want to, I think what you've done a good job on this, and I think it is important to deflate illusions in liberal thinkers. And I think that is an important job that has been done. But I do think and I've read his rebuttal to you, which he says, oh, I have to do this because the London Review of Books has published two of these idiots' articles and he's a moron, but I have to. And you read through it and it's very slippery, But there are a couple of things where he picks you up on one. So on the cosmic ray thing, the full quote of what Chomsky says is, it's almost as if a cosmic ray. He doesn't seriously claim that it was a cosmic ray. All right, well, he didn't say that at the beginning, so you might know that, but I don't think everybody knows that, so I'm just saying that. And the other thing I want to, which is more of a serious question, is about funding. So if you're a scientist, a young scientist, I know lots of quantum physicists. Almost all quantum physics in Britain, in Australia, in the United States is funded by IARPA or DARPA. They are defence and intelligence related funding organisations. I know lots of people who have taken money from them and there literally is no strings attached. Publish openly here. You're trying to invent something very fundamental. I find it hard to say, I'm not saying this is what Chomsky did, by the way, I'm just saying this raises the questions about funding of science in a militarised capitalism. Do we say to these young scientists, oh, you should never take any money that comes from the military or defence, even if they literally don't care what you're doing? And I think that does happen. I find that hard to just say no to that. We haven't got an alternative model for investing in science. We should be demanding one. But most quantum physicists, solar, all sorts of scientists get funded by military or military-aligned funding agencies. And I was told once, and I'll finish on this, is you'll know when quantum physicists are doing direct military research because they'll disappear from the publishing record. They'll go dark in that sense. But until then, people publish. Lots of science is dual use, potential military and non-military And I don't think we should be telling scientists, you shouldn't be doing that because the military might use it one day. Of course they might use it one day. So I don't know, and I think Chomsky sort of slips around that fact. I mean, clearly he was employed by MIT in the military, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure what we say to a young scientist at the moment around those questions. I'll be interested in your reflections.
Mike.
It's just, I guess, a couple of very short points. Sorry, it's just a couple of very short points, one of which is Trivers in Deceit and Self-Deception. He's perfectly open that Trivers, is untrustworthy. Robert Trivers, he's completely transparent. He says, I'm untrustworthy. And he tells stories about his own dishonesty and his own self-deception and self-persuasion that what he wants is the right thing. Actually, paradoxically, that probably makes him more to be taken seriously as offering an evolutionary argument in favour of the importance of self-deception. I don't know enough about evolution to be able to do that, but it's sort of slightly more believable. Epstein was clearly a thief and a fraudster from the absolute beginning of his career. He becomes a big financier, essentially. The MIT published, New York Times published this stuff. He becomes a big financier, essentially by taking clients off his former employer, which is fine. It's illegal, but it's not in itself dishonest, but then deceiving them. And then the funds which he'd stolen from them were applied to sharp lawyers to prevent them recovering which is, how shall I put this? It's theft by law, which is a quite common, is a quite common phenomenon. But then back to Chris's stuff. My impression, actually, from what you've told us before and told us this time, is that the problem with Chomsky is not so much the fact that he took funding from the military and that he was took funding from the military and was an anti-militarist, but that his whole theory of language is constructed on the supposition that cognition has to work like a mainframe. And that therefore, in effect, the setting then actually poisons the science in a way in which the setting doesn't poison the science, with guys who are taking indirectly military funding to do quantum theory or stuff like that. That's it.
Dan.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. That was a great learning experience in so many ways. But a bit following on from Marcus in a way, but I don't get this, what you put across at the end, very moving, a tragedy, and above all, for you to talk about there being two Chomskys. There's not two Chomskys. I think that you sort of undermine your own credibility towards language and understanding. There was one Chomsky, and he's clearly a complete hypocrite, and most likely a sociopath, and deserves no tears shed. The Pope could have said this, the head of the UN could have said, this is hypocrisy as well. And he doesn't deserve the credit, he doesn't deserve the excuses, and it needs those who have followed him, and above all, the big problem with him was his sort of utter individualism. That's why they encouraged him. Whatever he was saying, he wasn't producing any real ways to fight back against this. It was all just, yeah, they're horrible, and here's a guy who's inside there. He knows. He's telling us, but he's not saved a single life, I would have thought, anywhere. And this is him exposed. And what will be interesting is those who have followed him. I mean, I think in terms of in Glasgow, he was such a big figure in Glasgow. Glasgow has always had a strong anarchist tradition, led in lots of ways by the writer James Kelman in recent years and others, is what they're saying. I've not picked up on them saying anything really of the, admitting that they had got it wrong. And I just see dangers in then giving them excuses to say, well, of course, that Chomsky, but it's the other Chomsky. That other Chomsky they're both the same and deserves no justification or support or any ounce of any sort of humanity in that sense. So
I'll have Chris come back.
Well, it's just that I know Mark, and I know quite a few other people, and I just know how much Chomsky meant as the one prominent, recognised figure who, I don't know, who you could sort of trust, who would say things which were the undeniable truth. And I felt about Chomsky, one of the ways I put it is that Noam Chomsky, and this is in the past of course, is the conscience of America. But I always used to add, insofar as the United States, America, insofar as American imperialism had a conscience, mostly it didn't have a conscience at all, of course, but insofar as it did, Noam Chomsky is that conscience. That's, I think, how he presented himself. And I'm not quite sure I agree with you, Tom. I do agree at the end of the day. I do agree with you that there's kind of nothing there. And of course, in one sense, in one body, in one skull, one brain, there's one person. But I also really genuinely think there was an element of self-denial about Chomsky. My own view is that the activist Chomsky kind of separated out from the militarist Chomsky, sort of chose not to see that other Chomsky, the militarist, found a way of getting on without interference with the other side of it. To me, if you're doing what Chomsky was doing, like every evening going off to a political meeting and denouncing the CIA, making very clear with all sorts of illustrations how their hands of the CIA, their hands are dripping with blood. And then of course you meet with the director of the CIA and lunch at a different time of day. You're going to have to put on a different sort of hat, a different persona, a different sort of almost personality. And my own view is that as near as any human being could get to it, he sort of divided himself into two and managed to avoid the activist Chomsky interfering with, getting in the way of the scientific Chomsky, and vice versa. And all of us are, who are we? Who am I? Who are you? I mean, I'm a slightly different person, in one environment, with my family maybe, my kids, and I am sort of over here. I mean, everyone's a slightly different person according to the social context you're in. But no one it's almost impossible to think of any major figure who was like so close to, like one side of being so close to the other side as Noam Chomsky. I mean, to be the world's number one, celebrated as the world's number one opponent of the US military, while guess what? working every day for year after year after year after year for the US military. I'm saying that he had to be sort of two different people. And I mean, obviously it's a kind of metaphor. Obviously he's one person, he's called Noam Chomsky, and there's only one of them, or was only one of them. But it's not a run-of-the-mill contradiction. He's a very strange, unusual figure, a part of his time, in many ways a symbol of the period he lived in, and all of us have to sort of go through. And I do see it as more interesting than just being one more two-timing bastard. I mean, when I say the two Noam Chomskys, you could think, and I think Chomsky thought, I'm saying that he's a two-timer. Well, in a way he's a two-timer, but it was a sort of sense in which each Chomsky was almost genuine. I mean, the scientist Chomsky he really believed in himself as a scientist. All of his colleagues were backing him up. They really valued his linguistics. I mean, all sorts of people valued his linguistics, partly because, of course, he got linguistics out of behaviorism. He got us to realise that the one thing actually right about Chomsky was that, our linguistic creativity is part of our nature. We're always talking about an instinct, an organ for language, and that is an improvement on a large part of what went before, when we had far too much sort of Marxism mixed up with Stalinism, and therefore mixed up with behaviorism, because a child learning language is much like a rat learning how to get out of a maze with rewards and shocks. B.F. Skinner, as well as counterparts in the Soviet Union, of course, did treat the way you teach child languages. You sort of reward it for getting the grammar right, and you punish it for getting the grammar wrong, because it couldn't be worse. Something much more attractive about the idea that the child is itself, it's got its instincts, it's got its own creativity. And there are aspects in which Chomsky's approach to language was refreshing and even correct, but of course it went from one extreme, language is entirely externally molded, the child is molded by external rewards and punishments, and then you get to the opposite extreme, which he did, which is it's entirely internal, it all depends no learning at all. So it's a ludicrous movement between oppositions. And I think I will defend my, I would say, more nuanced appraisal of Chomsky. That just simply is a two-timing bastard.
No, it's not that. He wasn't seen, he's not seen as an enemy, as a threat by the US military. They've never, he's never been
You're absolutely dead right. You're absolutely right. There's no question on that. He didn't do anything to organise anything. He would just have a sort of conscience. He would say things which are kind of true about imperialism. Why did imperialism tolerate him? Why did the US military establishment kind of love him? I mean, one of the great questions, of course, is, he was supposed to be designing weapons command and control systems. The first method didn't work. It's equal to standard theory. Then you had the extended standard theory. Didn't work. Then you had the revised extended theory. Didn't work. I mean, one after another, nothing worked. I mean, if nothing worked, why did they keep backing him up, paying him, celebrating him? Well, because something did work. Because I'm agreeing with you on this one. My own view, there were very good reasons why the US military-industrial establishment did well by helping to make sure that the guy sort of leading the US left was under their supervision and control. If Chomsky hadn't been there, maybe the US left would have found its own voice, would have found different voices. The military establishment might have not. Where the hell are these people organised from? Well, what they liked was having the left kind of organised from a place they knew all about. They could go and teach at MIT, and they could go and have lunch with him. I understand that. I get that, and I get what you're saying. I'm just saying. I just feel there's more to it, Tam. I'm not disagreeing with what you are saying. But I just think to say he's one more of his two-timing bastards and of not much interest. I think there's something fascinating about, and another way of putting it, by the way, is this almost US ideology replacing, or as an alternative to Marxism. It's called scientism. You sort of elevate science into a sort of eternal set of truths, and science becomes a sort of secular religion in the States. There's a thing called science, and I think Chomsky embodied that sort of thing called science with a capital S as a kind of religion, scientism I call it, more than anyone else. So Tom, I mean you're right, and maybe you're at the most fundamental and important level you're right, which is of course politics. But I don't think I'm wrong. I just wanted to mention one or two other little things here really. That somebody on the Zoom, I think, was saying, now we have a sort of realization of Chomsky's dream, which is these large language models, which, I mean, I'll just say very briefly, in the time when Chomsky was first employed at MIT, his job was machine translation. He said, I'll work on it. I'll do the theory of machine translation. In fact, he wasn't interested in machine translation because he realized already that you would need large language models. He actually said the only way you're going to get a sentence translated to another sentence in a different language is by having a large enough memory on your computers and use sort of statistics to work out the probability of a sentence meaning this or meaning that, or translated to this and that. Well, that's how modern machine translation works. With just huge amounts of memory. In his day, his computers hardly had any memory, and that's why he wasn't interested. But it's an entirely different concept than Chomsky's idea that when you're translating, Chomsky's idea was that you have a thing called universal grammar at the very basis of all languages, because it's part of our genetic nature. And if you want to translate between, say, a sentence in Russian and a sentence in English, you translate the Russian sentence into UG, universal grammar, and then uppercase from there into, say, English. But you have to know how to translate, first of all, down into this underlying grammar. The trouble is, there's no such thing as this underlying thing called universal grammar, so that sort of doesn't work. So the only thing which might eventually work, and of course now it works fine. I mean, I'm astonished at how easy it is to translate a whole paragraph of Spanish into English or something. It's incredible, but I mean, there's no chance of that happening. But it's an entirely different approach from Chomsky's. And then on taking military money, of course, if you can find some money from somewhere with those strings attached, obviously you should do it. The point I'm trying to make is that when Chomsky was first given money, and actually when MIT was first granted the most of the military funding which it received, which it then passed on to Chomsky, it was not no strings attached, and there's no way that Chomsky and the other scientists working at MIT could do what they liked. Chomsky was supposed to be making systems of command and control. That's what he's employed to do. It was only later on that it became so. Why was he so effective? Why was he so effective with, people, I mean, I'd say people like Mark, but many other wonderful, valuable colleagues? It's because when he spoke, his words had a ring of truth. Why did he have a ring of truth? Because when he was talking about US imperialism, he was an insider. He was talking as one of them. He knew what they were doing because he met with them every day. He was part of the same institution. That's why what he said has a ring of truth. The only place where you could hear the voice of an insider telling you what US imperialism was doing, Chomsky was that voice, telling you what, because he knew, because he was having meals with them every day and chats with them over lunch. So that's the value of Chomsky. He was an insider prepared up to a point to spill the beans. And that point that he was prepared to spill the beans sort of up to was fine by US imperialism. They could cope with it. As you say, Tam, he was no threat at all. And in fact, he was part of the sort of oil of the system. He kept the machinery running by being there. I think it would be better for imperialism to have Chomsky around than not to have him.
We have about 15 minutes. I have 4 more speakers, so we might not get to everyone. Apologies in advance. First, Jasmine.
Yes, critique published Chris's articles on
Could you come a bit closer here? Thank you.
Did it get any response?
There was no negatives, there wasn't any problems, so it was okay, I suppose, but I'm sure online there were swear words. On LLMs, I agree entirely with what you said. Chomsky's idea are about generative capacity in terms of language, while LLMs rely on huge statistics, neural networks. They are the exact, in fact, you could say it's the exact opposite of. He didn't live long enough. He wasn't active as a scientist. He's alive, but he wasn't active as a scientist during this time, and there is no connection. I think there is no such a thing as a free lunch. So once you accept funds from a military organization, you have to accept that you are selling yourself. There is no such thing. I used to work in a department of mechanical engineering in Glasgow University. Financial pressures meant that aerospace engineering became the dominant department. So I had my last 2 years was in aerospace engineering. We had a dean with a very great sense of humor. As you can imagine, aerospace engineering in Glasgow was funded considerably by British aerospace engineering. He started funding meetings by saying that the university had put pressure on him for diversity. And he looked at me and said, we have to consider, a woman, our only woman in aerospace engineering from an ethnic minority. Academically, I was nowhere near to be head of department, right? But that was his sense of humor. And in a way, he was trying to tell British aerospace engineering, we need your money, but we are not going to do everything you want. Here is someone from Iran, and I'm just saying this as a joke, but the joke has a meaning. And you will not be surprised, I resigned 2 weeks before his retirement as Dean of Engineering, because I knew I couldn't live anymore in that university as any job. So funding, yes, funding is now by aerospace, by military. But I'm afraid you have to say no. There is a department in where I am now where drones are being developed, and medical aid for Palestine, who is at the same university, the medics who go to Gaza, showed us in a meeting in that institution that the drones developed by engineering is going into hospitals, finding where Hamas supporters might be hiding, and then the next drone that goes bomb them, right? So I don't think there is such a thing as working for the military and then saying, oh, well, that's my job. Hillel Tichting in Glasgow had a very strong principle for those of us who were in critique, not for everyone, of course, that wasn't a principle for everyone. And that was that what you do politically is the same as what you do academically. And in this he criticized Socialist Worker Party people who in UCU were radical and then went to departmental meetings, and in their departmental meetings they were quite soft with management, They went along, and they did get much quicker than Hillel professorial titles because they worked with the system. So I think you make personal choices. I'm not telling anybody else what to do, but you make personal choices, and those personal choices define who you are politically. So if you want to be part of critique, you can't then go around and say, okay, British aerospace funding, yeah, I'll turn a blind eye.
I'm no psychologist, but I think if you're walking down a dark alley and you see someone coming towards you, you've got to make a black and white decision. Is that person a threat or not a threat? And you make that decision and hopefully you're okay. And I think there's a tendency in all our minds to do that when it comes to political issues. Someone is either completely bad or completely good. I mean, social media is an extreme version of that, but I think we all have a habit of doing that. I mean, Keir Starmer, for example, this is someone who I suspect as a young man was some genuine kind of Marxist in a rather limited way, but he was a semi-leader of a sort of a semi-Trotskyist sect in the 1980s, Socialist Alternatives. Nowadays, obviously, he's something completely different. So in that case, you have to make a political decision. He's now completely bad and we're now going to denounce him rather than making any concessions to what he was in the past. I think when it comes to an intellectual like Chomsky and these much bigger theoretical issues, looking at things like that is not helpful at all. I think we have to be more nuanced and subtle and to involve this incredible contradiction. This is someone, to give one example, it might impresses me, but he was a friend of Paul Matik, who'd been a left communist activist during the German Revolution. And he was sort of a very orthodox Marxist, but kind of a left communist, or very influential, wrote a book, Marx and Keynes and others. And Chomsky clearly learned some of his Marxism through Paul Matik. Now, for someone who is connected to that aspect of the revolutionary tradition, and also is a liberal member of the establishment, this is a fascinating character. And then makes this appalling, tragic error of getting involved with Epstein, and in some ways maybe even enabling his abuse. Not entirely clear whether he did or didn't. But it's an epic tragedy. And I think to look at people like that and to say, well, either they're all good or all bad, we're missing out on so much of what it is to be human, what it is to be an intellectual, what it is to live this life. I mean, to go on another, which Marcus raised and others have raised this very interesting issue. To what extent was he really working for the military, not working for the military? But I mean, my understanding is that the US military, for the first time in history, I suppose, the military, we're not going to get anywhere, we're not going to be powerful unless we fund pure science, because that's where they got the atom bomb from. So they obviously thought at the end of the Second World War, we're going to fund everything that might possibly help us in the future. So does that mean everything they fund is completely innocent, because they're funding kind of everything? Well, yes and no and maybe, and it gets very complicated, and it's certainly not the case that Chomsky is simply working for the music department at MIT. He's working for the Research Laboratory of Electronics, and he's working for the country's top war scientist, Jerome Wiesner. So clearly but it's a grey area. You've got to look at it sort of in that kind of more nuanced way. And that's the point, I think, of Chris's book. He can say better than I can, which is that there's a reason why Chomsky's linguistics becomes hegemonic. It's because it has this military funding, and other sorts of linguistics, perhaps more to Chris's liking, are not funded. So well, it is a conspiracy kind of. It's not black and white. It's nuanced. It's the way capitalism influences our society, influences our minds, influences us as individuals. And to look at things in kind of black and white terms that all of us leftists, including myself, have a habit of doing when we're denouncing this character and picking up someone else, that doesn't help us when it comes to intellectuals like Chomsky, I
don't think. Thank you, Chris. And by the way, the book, Decoding Chomsky, it's a beautiful read. It's beautifully written. So having plumosed you now, no, I'm not going to really disagree with you. I just wanted to, so for me, like looking at this and watching what's been going on, it seems that the most important question is the elitist circles within which Chomsky moved. Within, obviously, persons connected with, involved with, part of the United States military machine, but also other intellectuals around that. And then, of course, the likes of Epstein. He's like not a stranger to these circles. And with that, like elitism, comes a complete refusal to accept criticism from a little known academic communist. Well, I mean, he doesn't deserve the ink, you know, that was his approach to you, wasn't it? And so you could feel crushed by that and say, well, of course, who am I, Chris Knight? But of course, you didn't feel crushed like that. You had the self-confidence to push on. But what you see in his approach to you, I think, is a small, is just a reflection of his general approach, I would think, to criticism. I get the impression that Chomsky liked people to agree with him, or if they disagreed with him, in a kind of a tangential way that didn't really challenge him. You directly challenged him. You said, what is the sense of your politics if you're also developing the military machinery? How can you criticize your employer, and carry on with that work? So I think, to me, just a final point is that he's part of a phenomenon, okay, an extreme example of a phenomenon within which academics and many political leaders on the left refuse accountability and become seen as, basically unchallengeable. And we make them into heroes, and that's very damaging for our movement. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. These are sort of rather disjointed thoughts. We all live in a capitalist society. I'm looking at a lot of comrades here. Some are too old to have jobs. Do you like the jobs that you have? A few people will. I know Mike loves the law, but the idea that law, didn't you tell us the other day that, £1.5 million for this law firm? Who employs lawyers? In the main, it's rich people. In the main, it's companies. Even, where you are now, Oxford. This is a capitalist institution for the benefit of capitalism. But, Glasgow University, Hillel's there. But ultimately, this is under the hegemony of capitalism. We're all under the hegemony of capitalism. So, although you made a choice, Yasmin, you did emphasise this was up to me, I think a lot of people cannot make that choice. Because whatever you do, you're doing something shit for a shit, or capital, whatever you want to call it. So if you have got a job that you love and you've got a clean conscience, I think you're extremely lucky in this society. So I really, sympathise with Mark in terms of we shouldn't just take their evil, their good. I actually don't think, I don't really like the term evil. Even with Adolf Hitler, he could be kind apparently to his dog. No, seriously. No doubt if you take his wife, from what I can gather, he would be nice to her. Nazis sometimes loved their children. So they're human beings, right? So I'm very wary. In the same way, though, I'm very wary, and I think this is the problem with Chomsky, of hero worship, elevation of the personality. And I do think that this is the result of the weakness of the left. That in the United States, you were speculating, Chris, if there wasn't a Chomsky, there would be something better, would there? Seriously, would there? I'm very sceptical about that. If you take the capitalist media, it elevates personalities. So if I said Extinction Rebellion, Green Protest, saying, what's her name? What? I've never heard of Gail. That's my point. Right? Exactly. I was trying to elicit it. I thought I'd get a straight away. because they've elevated her into Miss Green, Miss Climate Protest, and you can get a protest of 10,000 people. She has to be what the cameras are going after.
I have to admit she's great.
I would be cautious. I'm not saying she's great. I'm not saying she's evil. I'm saying she's a human being, right? And I'm very cautious about elevating people like that, or anyone, onto a pedestal. Vietnam War protest, Tariq Ali. Or if you wanted to bung in a second, Vanessa Redgrave. But Tariq Ali. Okay, Tariq Ali, member of the IMG for a short time as I understand it. He also wrote, what was it, Revolution from Above, dedicated to his great comrade Boris Yeltsin. Yes. Now, you know, every time I listen to Tariq, I've got a certain admiration for him, a certain admiration. Most of the time, though, you know, given my politics, I'm going, oh my God, he's... Okay, so I don't want to be in a position of saying Tariq Ali is a CIA agent. Maybe he is, but I don't think he is. But I don't want to just denounce him, throw him away, say he's complete rubbish, or, and this is the danger, elevate people. And I do think that when it came to the anti-war movement, the Vietnam War movement, because the US left was weak, you've got this personality, you've got this famous scientist. I don't think, I mean, I'm a bit too young, too young. Sorry, I just want to work out. I don't normally come. I'm a bit too young to remember exactly. I don't think he was elevated because he worked in MIT. I think he was elevated because he's Mr. Protest Man. That was sort of my memory. I might be wrong. Put me right.
I think you are wrong.
Okay, well, tell me.
In fact, he's a very famous MIT scientist.
Okay.
Big difference.
Okay, I'll wait for you to come back. Last point I was going to make, really, is if his science was great, right? Imagine that. Imagine his science. We should praise the science. We should value. If you shake your head, I just think that's crazy. We should value the science. And I'll just give you my final example. I don't know if anyone knows him. Carlo Gesualdo. I had to look him up on my phone. He has composed some of the most divine music I've ever heard. And when I listen to it, I go to heaven, right? It's like, he murdered his wife. He was a complete nutter. In order to poo, he had to get he had to get his servants to beat him, right? Now, I cannot help, when I listen to that music, in the back of my head, I know that, but it still sends me to heaven. I do not feel guilty when I listen to that music. And that's really my view, if the science was good.
What was his name? Gesualdo, right.
Look it up.
Okay, Gesualdo.
Anyway, I'm going to finish with that one, that's it.
We've read a bit over time.
Well, I just say I can't follow that. I don't know. Sorry.
The point here isn't...
Come on, Kimberly, say it. Kimberly's going to say it.
The point here isn't, is his science right or not? The point here is Chris's book worked out why the science was so fucked up, because he was in this contradictory situation. And it couldn't be good. The science couldn't work because he was being fucked up by the situation.
Well, that's another whole dimension of it. I mean, the point about science, real science, is that it's the only form of collectivist knowledge that we've got. Science is truly collectivist, you know. H2O, electrolyzed water, you're going to get 2 volumes of hydrogen, 1 of oxygen. I mean, you know, and if you know that, it's going to work for you whether you're Catholic, Protestant, black, white, male, female, blah, 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 right across the planet, that's the molecular structure of water, and so on and so on and so forth. There's something special about science, which is why, of course, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels insisted that socialism, to be revolutionary, had to be, I even think the word scientific isn't enough. More than being like more or less scientific, it had to be science. Science is revolutionary. But it has to join up science, not little bits of science cut out and tailored and manufactured for this purpose. Science as such, science joined up. The reason for trying to join up the humanities with the natural sciences and doing that through tracing the evolution of the one turning into the other, from natural objects and things turning into us humans with a voice, is to join together science. Science is revolutionary. And what Chomsky produced, the reason it wasn't science, as Camilla said, he was in the wrong kind of milieu, he was in a complete cleft stick, a complete contradiction, trying to join things which are just incommensurable with each other, namely, imperialism with some kind of left-wing, that set of values and politics. So, yeah, and it's, to me, it's always been, I think it's possibly because when I was in my teens, I was entirely dedicated to science. As a teenager, I was doing maths, physics, and chemistry. I thought nothing else works. All these other ideologies are just completely stupid. And I just felt somehow science is revolutionary. You've got to stick with the science, but the science itself has got to embrace everything, us, the subjective aspect of things, as well as out there, objective things you can look through a telescope out or through a microscope out and the rest of it. But somehow, Marxists have been terrible, I would say, actually since Marx and Engels. I don't even think Trotsky and Lenin were all that brilliant at science, to be honest. Marxists have been terrible around continuing the work of the early Marx and Engels. Somehow, we've lost the plot and just forgotten that, the only form of knowledge which is revolutionary is autonomous, revolutionary science. Thank you.
Apologies for running a bit over.